Hey, Lucas, welcome to the Token Economy podcast. Thanks for being on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, let's get right into it. How about you introduce yourself and Toby and what you all are up to for people who don't know you?
Of course. Hey, everyone. My name is Lucas. I'm originally from Madrid, Spain. I've been living in the United States for around 6 or 7 years at this point. Around 2 years ago, I founded Toby, which is a simultaneous speech translation startup focused specifically on multinationals and large enterprise. And so the pocket that we found is that a lot of translation tools, particularly on the consumer side, don't have the accuracy that's required for very high end translations, specifically for large companies, multinationals that have a lot of complexity. And so we're selling mainly to Asian multinational companies such as Toyota and Panasonic internal translation tools for employees to be able to communicate with one another in global offices. And so that's what we do.
That's very cool. And I feel like there's so much to talk about on the Toby end, but I want to take a step back. I feel like we've known each other for quite a while now, and you were very early to voice AI. How
Mhm.
did you even get excited about what AI, voice AI, and get into it? Because I know you were at Columbia, and then you worked for Reid Hoffman's family office. When and how did you get excited about voice?
Yeah, of course. So it's funny. I mean, I think similar to a lot of people, I became very interested in startups during college. So before college, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, and I used the 4 years in college to just explore different areas of interest that I thought were compelling. And one of them was startups, and I just became completely fascinated. My freshman year, a friend of mine who I met was working on a startup at the time. It was a hardware startup, and this was in 2018, right before COVID. So it was a very, very difficult time, 2018, 2019, because COVID shut everything down. But I completely was fascinated by the startup world and everything that it entailed and how fast paced it was and how much impact you had at a very early stage. And so I knew that I really wanted to continue. I'd had a few different experiences during college related to tech and startups, just exploring different areas. And so I was at an early stage startup as an intern, Merge, helping them with product work, with growth work, a bit generalist. And then I was at Amazon very briefly in a product role as well, just trying to learn and see what areas I was most interested in. I realized that I was really drawn to early stage. I liked Amazon, but felt that it was a bit too big and bureaucratic for me. And so when graduation rolled around and I was trying to identify what I should do next, I decided to turn down my return offer from Amazon and just kind of take the entrepreneurial plunge. I didn't really have a clear plan. I didn't have a co-founder or an idea at the time, but I just knew that I really wanted to build. So I basically pitched it to my parents and my family as a gap year, but instead of traveling the world, I would be living in New York, trying to make money on the side part time while developing ideas on my own and with friends. And so that was essentially the pitch. I didn't have much of a plan, but I just wanted to jump in. I was very fortunate that through just meeting different people and being in the right circles and just a lot of luck, frankly, I was able to get connected to Reid Hoffman's personal team. And so I was working with them part time to on a very generalist role, helping them mainly doing marketing for a book that he was promoting at the time, but helping him with different AI projects that he was working on, initiatives that he was interested in. This was it was just post ChatGPT, but pre kind of the true proliferation of AI startups. And so there were just very, very early projects that he was tinkering on. And one of the organizations that he was very loosely involved with was called the Earth Species Project, which is a nonprofit based in San Francisco that's trying to decode animal language. And so their pitch is they have a very small team trying to essentially speak with whales, is their first beachhead market. And I thought it was completely fascinating.
That's so cool.
I thought it was incredible. And it was the first, I don't want to say it was the first, but it was one of the first, early stage scrappy tech initiatives that I was just completely enamored by. And so that was honestly my introduction to voice, was just hearing about what they were working on, becoming completely fascinated that this tech was even possible, and seeing what were other areas in voice that some of this technology could be applied to. And that slowly led to Toby.
Totally. That makes so much sense. And talk to talk to us a little bit about how did you even find your co-founder? Because I feel like so many people are in that same journey where they feel like they want to do early stage startups, either have an idea or don't have an idea, but want to look for a co-founder and want to build it with someone. How did you find your co-founder?
Yeah, so I mean, the first few months after I graduated, when I was in New York, that was a big, concern of mine, or something that was very top of mind. I should mention also that I'm self-taught in terms of coding and computer science, and so I've taken a few classes. I could defend myself, but I'm definitely not technical by Silicon Valley standards, I would say. And so I was trying to figure out exactly what the best way to find a potential co-founder was. I was on YC co-founder match. I was just meeting people through friends and friends of friends. I was fortunate enough to meet my co-founder, who is extremely technical and had a pretty similar background to mine. So I mentioned I grew up in Spain, studied in the United States. My co-founder is French, grew up in China, and came to the US for university at Carnegie Mellon. And so we met through mutual friends. We actually started working together a few months later. But a lot of what brought us together was just the fact that we had very similar backgrounds, and both of us were extremely excited about voice AI and translation specifically. So I think given, the combination of being bicultural, both of us are multicultural, plus the fact that my co-founder had been doing a lot of translation research in grad school and in his previous role in machine learning and NLP, just as the ChatGPT moment was happening, convinced us that this was the right space at the right time to jump in together.
That is so cool. And I know you moved to San Francisco now, but you were clearly building in New York at first, and you were at Columbia.
Mhm.
What is the New York startup scene like? Because I've never,
Mhm.
I moved here for Stanford, basically never left, and like I
Mhm.
feel like there are ramp and there are a handful of extraordinary companies in New York, but really everybody's moving back to San Francisco. What was New York like in 2018? What led to your move here? And so many other. I have so many more questions about this.
No, of course, it's funny. I feel like that's a recurring debate that I have with founders in SF, with founders in New York, that I think about a lot. I mean, for us, we actually. So I mentioned that I pre Toby was tinkering on different ideas in New York, had studied in New York, and so I had a pretty good sense of what the ecosystem was like at the time in New York. We founded the company in New York and actually came to San Francisco, which was supposed to be only for a few weeks to fundraise. And we realized that it was by far the best place to be for what we were building. And so we would host a lot of different voice AI events in New York when we were first founding the company, just to learn from different researchers, understand where the space was, and essentially just crowdsource knowledge from different people and get a good lay of the land. And so when we moved to San Francisco, we did that same thing. We would just host different events, and we felt like the caliber of people who were pushing the frontier in voice AI technology was so much stronger in San Francisco that that's ultimately what convinced us to move. But it's funny because I vividly remember sitting on the flight from New York to San Francisco with my co-founder and telling him that there was less than a 5% chance that we would actually move to San Francisco, because I was just convinced that New York was the place to be. I felt like I had friends there, I had a life there, I had my family back in Spain, so it was much closer. And San Francisco felt very just distant in many ways. I didn't know it, I didn't know many people. And so I definitely didn't think that we were going to move here. But after spending a few weeks here, we just realized that it's what was best for the company. And it was actually my decision more than my co-founders of really saying, look, if we really want to give Toby a fair shot that it deserves, we should be prepared to do whatever it takes. And moving to San Francisco seems like one of those decisions that we have to make.
I agree. I feel like I've had this conversation so many times where a lot of people come to San Francisco and
Mhm.
the energy is magical. There's something about San
Yeah.
Francisco and the people here. And part of it might be, I was just reading on Tech Twitter, which is San Francisco is the best place to build because there's nothing really to do other than work. It's either people who are working or people who are talking about work, and
Yep.
in some funny ways that creates the best. The San Francisco is I would argue the best accelerator on the planet, because when you come here, it's such a different energy. But coming back to voice AI, so what do you think is the biggest opportunity in voice AI right now, as somebody who is building in this space and of course is connected with all of these founders?
That's a good question. I mean, I think so. To give some context, I mean, I think voice AI has really changed in the past few years. And so, if you look at 2 years ago when we were founding the company, or even three right before when we were when we were just ideating or thinking about it, the space really hadn't developed like it has today. Text-to-speech models were just starting up to be, of the caliber that they are today with companies like 11 Labs or Cartesia. Speech-to-text, there were some players at the time, but transcription word error rate was still very high, and so transcription quality was a big issue. And a lot of the interactions that people had with voice AI tools were Alexa or Siri or that kind of first wave of
Yeah.
voice AI tools, which left a bad taste in, I think, a lot of users' mouths, to say the least.
To be very polite, yes.
To be very polite. And so I think if you would have asked me 1 year ago versus today, I think the answer of where the opportunities lie are very different, just because there's been so much more interest in voice AI recently. And so I know, countless of companies that are focused on building voice AI bots that didn't exist a year or two ago. Something I've been thinking about more deeply that I've seen some companies capitalize on is one of the benefits of voice AI is you're able to collect much more rich and nuanced information than you are through text. And so a company that I think does this very well, for example, is Listen Labs, that you might know, which is using voice AI interviews to essentially conduct extensive user research, which previously was done through surveys or forms that are much more constrained in terms of the amount of information that you're able to collect or the granularity of that information. And so I think being able to apply that Listen Labs model of being able to use voice AI tools to collect information that's very rich or extensive to other verticals, such as political polls or lead qualification. Imagine if every time you go to book a demo on someone's website, instead of filling out 5 questions about your budget or your role or different things, you have a 2-minute conversation with a voice AI bot. I think that those types of things will be really beneficial in terms of having a more holistic picture about a user or a person or a persona.
Oh, totally. And voice is clearly the next modality. Like from text, it goes to voice, and then we go to video, and we go to all the other modalities. And it feels it's so early in voice that everybody talking about video, I'm like, you gotta wait for your turn. Voice comes first, and then and then the other pieces come. And it's great that you mentioned Listen, because I think they're a great example of a company that is doing extraordinarily well in this really incredible use case, which is clearly so high ROI.
Yeah.
How do you think about companies like Listen and others that are building, either Listen feels like they're building a more horizontal tool versus there are companies that are also building vertical specific agents?
Mhm.
How do you think about competitive differentiation for companies like these? Because clearly, like, they're one layer above in the stack with respect to just they're not building the model, they're building something more specific, and like they're really productizing the intelligence is the way I think about it. How do you
Yeah.
think about the differentiation and really uh, the long term value of these businesses?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think I have many thoughts here. The first one I'll say is that we're definitely going to see more consolidation in voice AI in the near term and in the long term, just because I think, like I mentioned, there has been a huge proliferation of companies that have spun up in the past few years. And I think that as you go from just owning one layer of the stack, whether that's text to speech on the model side or transcription or the product layer, like you mentioned, everyone is going to start stepping on each other's toes, and that's going to lead to consolidation long term. So I definitely think that that's one trend that we're going to see. But in terms of that, ever long question of do you go more horizontal or do you verticalize? I think that what I've realized is we're likely to see a lot of commoditization on the model front, in the sense that I don't think that users, whether they're enterprises or consumers, have the interest, frankly, or the know-how to differentiate between models when they're very, very close on different benchmarks, whether that's latency or accuracy or naturalness or things like that. And so I do think that the model layer is going to get commoditized, and I would argue that it already has to some degree. And so what's really going to be beneficial long term from a competitive advantage perspective is being able to have that end relationship with the customer. And I mean, a perfect example of this, to be honest, is 11 Labs. If you look at the progression that 11 Labs has been on in the past 2 or 3 years, I mean, we used to go to events early on, and when they were a very small company, their core focus was on dubbing for movies in
Yeah.
different languages. And so the narrative was always, we have these two, Polish founders who are in the UK who are very interested in just understanding why dubbed movies in Polish are as bad as they are, frankly, and trying to see if there was a way through synthetic audio generation to make the dubbing higher quality. And if you look at the progression, I mean, their pitch deck, I think you could even find their pre-seed pitch deck online. If you search for it, it might even still be available. But the narrative that they've gone through in the past 2 years has shifted pretty drastically, I would argue, because they've gone from focusing specifically on text to speech and focusing specifically on dubbing use cases, which in some ways is similar to what we were doing with translation, to all of a sudden realizing that a lot of the opportunity lies in the end-to-end system, which is not only the text to speech piece, but how do we create both a transcription piece as well as a speech generation piece, and then package that in a way that it's useful for users. And so now they have 11 lab agents, and they are focused more on customer service use cases than they were before, because they realize that the big opportunity, or one of the big opportunities in voice AI, is servicing multinational or enterprise companies with customer service. So all this is to say, when you have a company like 11 Labs that arguably had the best text-to-speech and still has the best text-to-speech model, going to an end-to-end system, but also focusing on those bells and whistles for enterprise and multinationals, I think that that's what we can expect from other voice AI players moving forward, is just moving away from the model layer being the core differentiator to actually servicing end customers.
Totally, and I think that was such a smart strategy because it was so clear that OpenAI, Anthropic, basically every lab is going to have their own voice model. Because if you're a consumer company, if you're an enterprise company, you're going to have some sort of a voice use case. And I also think people profoundly underestimate how big voice is going to be because I just had a friend whose car broke down, and of course, what's the first thing you do? You call your insurance company, or you call a mechanic, or you call there are 5 different people to call, and all of these calls are you should be using AI, and along with that, the complexity of these calls. Let's say a car breaks down and you need to call insurance on a bunch of different things, and you need to call the mechanic at the same time, and all of these things. The complexity is increasing,
Yeah.
and the amount of just the dollar spent, the sheer dollar spent on customer support and all of these things is just so massive. And I agree. It feels like we're kind of in the very, very early stages of that. One very interesting thing you mentioned is the benchmarking around latency and speed, and along with that on actual accuracy. You work with lots of enterprises. What do enterprises care most about? Is it latency? Is it accuracy? Like what ends up being the long pole that they're most focused on?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think I'll start by saying that it really depends on the use case. For us, we're a bit of a unique situation where we are providing essentially human-to-human interactions with an AI layer in between those two, while most voice AI companies are providing human-to-AI interactions. And so the AI is a bot, whereas we're not necessarily providing AI bots as part of our offering. So for us, I would say the 3 biggest benchmarks that we have, both internally and with customers, are latency, accuracy, and fluency. And I would argue that for translation and RP, since we are focused on enterprise-grade translation, accuracy is by far the biggest benchmark. Latency is a close second, because I think being able to have that, feeling that you're in a natural conversation is pretty important, and latency is critical for that. Fluency, I don't think, is as important as those other 2, but again, it goes into that feeling of, are we having a natural dialogue back and forth, or are we having a very robotic experience alter that? For most voice AI bots, I would argue that it's slightly different. I don't think that accuracy is as big a priority since, again, a lot of the accuracy comes down to how accurate is the transcription, which in the past few years has become quite accurate. And how good is the LLM, which I would argue isn't necessarily a voice AI issue. So I would think that for most voice AI companies, the biggest benchmark is on the latency front, and then accuracy from a transcription piece probably takes a bit of a second position there.
Yeah, and you found this really interesting niche in Asia of like in translation. How do you even figure out this was the niche to target? How do you meet the customers? Like tell us all about that journey, because I feel like I know you personally, and we play golf together all the time, and it's so clear that you're hustling really hard and you've been able to figure out this niche in the market. How did you even figure that out?
Yeah, I mean, I will say the honest answer is it was a lot of mistakes, a lot of trial and error of trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. So the initial opportunity that we went after was in Latin America, just because we felt like With COVID and remote work, there was a rise of offshoring, and we thought that it could be pretty interesting to kind of jump on that wave. And we're seeing a lot of market pull from Latin American companies, mid market, SMB, who are interested in hiring very good talent that didn't speak English. And so that was the main area that we went into. We recognized pretty quickly that it wasn't the best market for a handful of different reasons. We got a lot of interest and were able to grow our waitlist to 50,000 developers who were Latin American developers hoping to find opportunities with US companies. The challenge was that many times, first of all, the willingness to pay wasn't as high as we needed to be able to justify being a VC-backed startup. And then secondly, we also saw that the opportunity cost of being able to hire an effective remote developer who spoke English for these companies was pretty low, in the sense that they would pay a bit more and they would just put up with the fact that it wasn't as cheap as they wanted to hire a developer to make sure that they spoke English, versus hiring a developer who didn't speak English and having to have these kinks and quirks of translation in between. And so we were exploring different markets. We had a few customers in Europe, both in Spain and in France, were some of the areas that we were looking into, given my co-founder and I and our backgrounds. And kind of out of nowhere, we received an inbound email from someone on Toyota's team. And at first, we didn't think much of it. We didn't take the email as seriously as we probably should have. But they followed up with us a few weeks later, and that's when we realized that it was a genuine business problem that Toyota had, of being able to manage global workforces and being able to have effective communication between different offices across the globe. And so that's when we booked, a trip to a one-way ticket to Tokyo. We on the
You take
plane.
lots of one-way tickets, I feel like.
A lot of one-way tickets necessary for startups, I think. But we were, reading about Japanese business culture on the flight. We shipped business cards to our hotel room in Tokyo because we realized that business cards were very important to Japanese business culture. And of course, in Silicon Valley, I probably haven't seen or touched a business card since I've been here. And so, it was definitely a very scrappy startup story. I would like to say that it was all planned from the beginning, but in retrospect, it's a very clear decision as to why it was the right fit for us, because the Asian markets are extremely large in
Yeah,
terms of willingness to pay. And for Japan specifically, less than 5% of the population speaks fluent English. And so there is a big need to be able to bring Japan or similar countries up to speed in terms of being able to communicate with foreigners or employees in other countries.
totally. And you mentioned you're kind of this self-taught programmer. In the
Mhm.
world of vibe coding, as you think about kind of building products, and you clearly are building like so many different things and really productizing this intelligence, what is your philosophy towards product building, and how much product do you build now? Because it feels like every time I'm talking to you, you're like, hey, I'm in Cloud Code or I'm vibe coding something. Like, what does that look like?
Yeah. So I will say AI, coding tools, Cloud Code, everything else is exceptional, and it's really transformed how we work, both myself and my co-founder, the rest of our team. So that's definitely been, a pretty incredible step change that we've seen in the past few months. In terms of myself and how I approach building products, I think, to be completely honest, the hardest, especially with vibe coding tools, I think the hardest question to answer now is not how do we build this, but what do we build? And being able to identify what exactly you build and for what reasons, for what end customer is the most important thing. And so the best piece of advice that I got, that I've really tried to live, is a lot of people will talk about shipping early, about being embarrassed about the first version of your product, or all of those things. The most extreme example of this that I've heard of is be in the physical room while your customer is first trying your product. And so whether it's taking a one-way trip to Tokyo, whether it's flying to Latin America, wherever it is, to just be in the office, be able to show the user exactly what you're building, and then have them test it out in front of you and see how they interact with it, how they play around with it, is the way that you're going to learn what to build. And ultimately, once you know what to build, then you can go on to the much easier step, which is working with your team or vibe coding tools to actually execute on the plan.
Yeah. And as you need less engineers to actually go and build some of these tools and build some of the product, What do you think is the biggest bottleneck in what you're building at Toby and generally and also broadly for the voice AI ecosystem in terms of what are the biggest bottlenecks for startups?
Ooh, I feel like there are a lot of areas that I could take this in. So, do you mean specifically what are the biggest bottlenecks for the voice AI industry, or do you mean what are the biggest bottlenecks for startups generally? Where would
No,
you like?
let's talk about voice AI specifically.
Okay. I mean, I think for voice, the biggest challenge that voice has always had is that it's a much more difficult medium to tackle than text. So, I mean, I mentioned before that through voice, you're able to get much more rich information because all of a sudden you don't have a constrained environment such as a text box. And with that, there's a lot of opportunity, but there are also many challenges. Because, I mean, to give you an example for translation, being able to communicate effectively between two people in different languages through an AI tool is already challenging enough. But if you introduce accents or you introduce dialects or slang, there's much more complexity. And then if you throw on top of that background noise or different microphone inputs, if I'm using headphones or if I'm using, a different speaker than you are, if I'm in a conference room and there are multiple speakers, there are a lot of complexities that can be added on here. And so to bring it back to your question, I think the biggest challenge that we have in the voice industry as a whole is being able to have accurate data for all of those complex and unconstrained environments. I think there's a lot of high quality data that you can find for, single speaker, very crisp and nice audio, very eloquently spoken. And there is a lot out there that you can find and use to fine tune or improve or, train models off of. But the challenge becomes when you start introducing a lot of these real world examples, how exactly do you get accurate data to make sure that your model is performing accurately? And so we talked, before about how voice is going to be one of the most important mediums going forward. And in a lot of these hardware devices where you don't have screens or interfaces such as robots, et cetera, voice will be a primary medium. If we're talking about robots as an example, and you want to put humanoid robots in industrialized factories across America, voice issues are going to come up in terms
Yeah.
of noise, in terms of multiple speakers, in terms of a lot of unconstrained environments that we just don't have data to support today.
Totally. And one of the things I've been thinking about has been just the fact that voice AI right now is getting to the stage where it's very useful. But then as we kind of put it in front of consumers, there's also the aspect of EQ, which is
Mhm.
does the model actually understand the way you're saying what you're saying and what and are you being sarcastic, are you not, how do you feel? And I feel like we had this moment in Silicon Valley a couple of months ago where Sesame's voice tool
Mhm.
absolutely blew up because and that was kind of one of the few feel the AGI moments. Like ChatGPT was one that felt like another to me where I felt like you could talk to the voice AI for a very long period of time because it actually felt like it understood what you were saying and not just literally what you were saying, but actually felt like actually understood how you felt. That seemed like still it's an unsolved problem. Like we were seeing the largest social media companies kind of work on this with massive teams, and nobody's been able to solve this. What are your views on how we can solve that problem from a technology perspective?
I think it's a very hard problem to solve because I think the biggest challenge with EQ specifically is that for IQ, we have very clear benchmarks of what exactly we're optimizing for. With EQ, if you ask, 50 different people on the street how you would define and measure EQ, I think most people would tell you something similar of being able to understand emotions or be empathetic or compassionate. But once you get down to actually measuring it and what good EQ looks like, I think you would have very different opinions depending on who you ask, because this also has different responses depending on how you were raised and what type of environment you were raised culturally, what country you were brought up in. And so it's unclear to me, to be completely honest, I agree with you that I think that's the direction we're moving in, and that's one of the big problems to solve is how can we make sure that these models understand sarcasm, humor, a lot of these more intangible things that go beyond just text input or spoken word input. But I think it's a very challenging problem to solve, and I'm curious to see how some of the researchers at Frontier Labs go about solving this problem.
Totally. And do you think this is one of the bottlenecks? Like we've talked a lot about enterprise and the use cases for voice in the enterprise, but then when it comes to consumer, we of course saw like character AI and a bunch of other really chatbot tools take off, but we haven't really seen any of the voice tools really take off in a similar fashion. Do you think this is the big bottleneck and really that is stopping users from saying, hey, like, I mean, think about Friend or any of these other kind of hardware devices that haven't, that there was a lot of hype and it seems like people are not using it as much. Do you think it's the EQ piece, or how do you, what do you think are the other pieces that are required for voice AI to really proliferate and in many ways enable more consumer use cases of AI?
Mhm. I definitely agree with you that the EQ piece is one of them because I mean the big difference between how I think most companies would approach enterprise having enterprise customers versus having consumer customers is that when we're talking about consumer customers for voice AI, many times similar to character AI, that would feed into entertainment, whereas I would position enterprise customers more as productivity use cases. So to make it very concrete, I wouldn't necessarily care about, maybe I would care slightly, but I don't think I would start cracking jokes with my customer service representative if I was a voice AI bot or if I
Yeah.
would be sarcastic or things like that. I think that's more important when you're talking about an entertainment use case, which I agree with you is more focused on consumer. So I think EQ is a piece as to why voice AI hasn't really been, as proliferated or had that ChatGPT moment for consumer applications specifically. I would also add that I think a big piece for entertainment is making sure that the user is always engaged and always has new content to turn to. So an easy example is TikTok. Every time I open up TikTok, it has arguably one of the most powerful algorithms in the world and is able to feed me what it thinks I will want in that moment, very, very personalized to my interests. With voice AI, I don't think that we've gotten there yet of being able to start a conversation with a voice AI tool or have a voice AI bot start a conversation with a user and have that user feel like they're completely entertained and completely engaged. So I think it's a combination of EQ and that feeling of realness, but also I would add being able to make sure that we have a way to entertain the user through a voice first medium.
Yeah, yeah, and across consumer enterprise, I'm sure there'll be different winners, but there's always this debate amongst founders and investors, and really in the valley, which is which part, who's going to win in different markets? Is it going to be the labs who win, or is it going to be startups? And where is their opportunity? As you think about, and you can break it down between consumer enterprise or however you think about kind of the voice AI ecosystem. Where do you see the labs winning, and where do you see startups winning?
And just to make sure I understand, by labs, would you mean the four main LLM providers, four or five main LLM providers?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, the OpenAI Anthropics of the world who are clearly building voice models themselves, and then there are startups like Listen Labs and others. Like, do you think startups even have a shot, or do you think the labs take a big piece of the overall market? Like, how do you kind of think about who wins and in what pockets?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes a bit back to what you were saying in terms of the horizontal versus vertical angle of, building a startup and what strategy you employ. I think this idea of being able to have a personalized assistant or a personalized companion in voice AI, it'll be very hard for a startup to compete in if they're playing just in that generalized field. But once you start going a bit more narrow or a bit more verticalized, I do think that there are definitely some opportunities. So, I mean, Listen Labs is a great example. And then on the consumer side, I mean, recently I was introduced to a tool called Sonia that you might know. That's a voice AI consumer mobile app that's focused specifically on AI therapy. And therapy is one of the biggest use cases for ChatGPT or similar tools. And so being able to carve out a niche where you're focused specifically on one use case that people have with ChatGPT and just making sure that it's extremely good, I wouldn't be surprised if we see winners there, both in consumer and in enterprise as well.
Yeah. And clearly there's this big focus on the data flywheel, which is as you take this one vertical, you collect lots of data on it. How do you help us understand how do you actually utilize some of that data in order to make your model more performant and to make the product better?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, again, it depends on your use case. For us, a lot of what we focus on is, again, making sure that enterprise grade translation and quality is at par of where we want it to be and is much higher than competing consumer translation tools. And so for us, a lot of collecting the data is being able to make sure that we're able to have personalized glossaries per user or per company that's focused specifically on their workflow, that's focused specifically on the types of jargon or technical terms that they're using on a day-to-day basis. And you can do that both at the prompt layer, but also at the fine-tuning layer.
Yeah.
And so by making sure that both of those are, integrated and that you have data that's able to improve the flywheel, you're able to improve the end user experience.
Totally. No, and the fine tuning part is so interesting because I feel like we've been talking about fine tuning for so long, but the overall model intelligence has gotten really, the intelligence has gotten really good. And now the question is, as you think about these specific use cases, like I'm thinking about, let's say, you're serving an automotive company or an automotive dealership or something, and there are all of these specific terms, and the only way to really get all of that intelligence and like the specific glossary of the industry or the company in it is by fine tuning. So do you think as you deploy some of these, as you deploy Toby into some of these companies, how much custom work do you end up doing for the to deploy the product itself? And I'm talking less about kind of integrating with the company itself, but at the product layer, on the model layer, how much fine tuning do you end up doing kind of pre and as you interact with the customer?
I mean, for us, it's a pretty important component because ultimately that's, our bread and butter and that's our differentiator is we're able to go to a company and say, our speech translation accuracy will be significantly better than competitors because we have a model that's tailored to your use case, to your employees, to your workflow. And so for us, I think that's a pretty big component. But I will say that again, I mean, as you alluded to, the models are getting better. And so a lot of the work that we had to do a year and a half ago when we were just looking into enterprise translation and these things, a lot of that work we're no longer needed to do to the same degree just because the capability of the model is getting better and a rising tide will rise all ships. And so we're able to ride that wave as well.
Very cool. And as a last question, I always ask this, which is, what's your wild prediction for 2026? Could be voice, could be anything, but what's your big wild prediction?
Ooh, it's funny. I actually was having lunch just today, just earlier today, with a mentor and advisor to us who has been helping us for the past 2 years, and we were chatting. He's a C-level executive at a smaller AI lab, and he was saying that he thinks that I know this isn't 2026, but this is a wild prediction that I thought could be interesting. Is he was arguing that in the next 10 or 20 years, kids will be raised without learning to use a keyboard. And so he thinks that voice is going to be so interesting and so just compelling to use compared to text that a lot of the devices we use on a day-to-day basis will be voice first, and kids won't be able to use a keyboard, and it'll be very similar to how a lot of students or kids today aren't taught to learn cursive. And so that was the analogy that he used. I don't know if we'll go necessarily that far because I think there are obviously some limitations to voice in noisy environments, in crowded spaces, things like that. But I thought that was an interesting prediction. For 2026 specifically, this isn't the most optimistic prediction, but I think that there will be a large nefarious use of voice AI in 2026 that will show the capabilities of the tech, but also all the harms that can be done. I think we've seen some of it in the past few years that I've been in this space with people, using voice AI bots to try to perform phishing, to try to scam people. We've seen it a bit in terms of people posing as politicians or different things, but I wouldn't be surprised if in 2026 we will see a very, very large scandal related to voice AI. I hope I'm wrong, but I think that the technology is at a point where it's extremely powerful and impressive, and I don't think that the vast majority of the population, both in the United States or elsewhere, realizes. And so I wouldn't be surprised if someone takes advantage of that arbitrage to try to use it for nefarious purposes.
And would you say that is how do you think guardrails kind of play into that in terms of, do you think we don't have enough guardrails right now in order to prevent something like that? Is that part of the prediction?
Partially. I think part of it is guardrails. I mean, there's been some regulation done in terms of outbound calls. You have to inform users that you're using a voice AI bot. Or in New York, for example, a recent legislation was passed that you have to indicate, I think it's every 3 hours that you're talking to a voice AI bot. So there is some legislation in place. I think that's part of it. I think the other piece, frankly, is just I don't think that there is broad awareness about the capabilities of these tools. And so I think many times when I show, friends, family outside of the space, some of the capabilities and the latest tech, they don't understand that they're talking to an AI, and they really think that they're talking to a human. And I think when we start adding, more data, when we start adding EQ, some of the components we've talked about today on the call, we'll be able to get to a level where it's very, very difficult to differentiate humans and AIs. And that's where a lot of both opportunities exist, but also a lot of worries in terms of how this technology is used.
Oh, 100%. And I feel like on Twitter, it's already hard to, on Instagram, it's already hard to tell which videos are AI generated and which are not. And I feel like, of course, in video, you can tell because you're looking at the video. But when you take out that modality and you just have voice, and somebody who doesn't fully appreciate the capabilities, that could totally happen. That sounds like a wild prediction that could very well come true.
I,
I
I,
hope it doesn't, but
I hope I'm
just like you
wrong. I
guys.
hope I'm wrong, but I wouldn't be surprised
Yeah.
given the capabilities of this technology. And also just, again, I mean, as we mentioned, there hasn't been a ChatGPT moment with voice AI, at least to the scale and kind of breadth that ChatGPT had. And so there is a bit of a gap between the current capabilities of the technology, which are incredible, and public awareness about the technology. And I think that's an arbitrage that we just have to be wary of.
100%. And but I will say I feel like we're at the inflection, which is also why I wanted to bring you on, because we feel like the curve at this point is the where we're at max velocity, where the proliferation of voice AI, we're seeing so much of it, which is why it was so great to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for coming on. And yeah, thank you.
No, of course. Thank you so much for having me. Very fun conversation.
Thanks.